Over the past 20 years, Amber's work has delivered new research, critical capacity and skills, partnerships, and campaigns. She's earned multiple awards and regularly speaks on the topic of climate communications. She holds a Bachelor of Public Relations and a Master of Arts in Environmental Education and Communication. Welcome, Amber Bennett.
Right. Well, I know it's been a long couple of days, so I will do my best to be punchy and interesting, but also appreciate that you have homes and places to go to. So I'd like to talk for about 15 minutes and then really save some time for conversation. So happy to go where the room wants to go. I found it very difficult, I have to say, to figure out where to focus for this presentation, in part because I think the topic of climate impacts and extreme weather and wildfires, et cetera, is kind of exploding at the moment. So really what I'm doing is sharing what other smart and thoughtful people are thinking about right now. And I've done my best to try to make sense of it and to pull it together. But we can have a conversation at the end of this. And I hope you find it useful. So one of the things that we talk a lot about at Re.Climate, not least of which because we focus on climate change communications and engagement, is that it doesn't really matter how much technology you have or how much really thoughtful policy you pull together. If people don't understand and if they don't support it, then change isn't possible. It really is through informed consent that you see actual change happening. And so that's a lot of what I'm talking about in the next couple of minutes is how do we get to the informed part of this? So it's not about persuasion. It's not about fancy, tricky language that's somehow going to like flip the switch for people, et cetera. This is in many ways the kind of underlying work that has to be done to better understand where we're going, what's going to happen when we get there, who's coming along, who's not coming along at the moment, and what does that mean for me and my family. And so what I would like to say is that for the people in this room, you are collectively holding stories and knowledge within your organizations, within your communities, that will make the difference for how others understand what this problem is and what's possible and what it means to them. So the stories that you're holding are really, really important. And I think you've probably heard a little bit about that today, but I just want to underscore it, right? So this is really about sharing what we know in a way that calls people to action, calls people to lean in and listen rather than shutting them down. And so there's a lot of people who are thinking about this around the world. I've talked to, many of them. I've read a lot about it. And there are ways that we know at the moment that will support the work that we have to do. So one of the other things I just wanted to say before we jump in is that I'm going to talk to you about extreme weather. I'm not going to talk to you about adaptation or resilience or, lots of other words that most people don't understand. Where Canadians are at right now is that they understand climate change and climate change impacts through extreme weather. That's how they're making sense of it. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about. And I'm pretty sure that there are people in the room who are going to tell me that that's not correct. And there's some nuance that I'm losing or et cetera, et cetera. But I'm going to hold tight on this piece because really extreme weather, for better or for worse, is our most powerful communication tool at the moment. For many years, people in this room and otherwise had to convince people that things were going to get bad, that we were going to see floods and fires and droughts and all of the things that we were talking about. Well, now they're here. And this is actually how people are making sense of the problem. And how do we use that to motivate? And how do we use that to create shared understanding about what the problem is and what it's going to mean for our communities? So there's a few fundamentals, and I tend not to talk in graphs and charts because I'm going to show you a slide later that tells you not to talk in slides and charts, but I'm going to do it anyhow. So where are we at right now? So for the most part, Canadians they're witnessing, they'll say that they're witnessing extreme weather and impacts, but very few people say that they've experienced them personally still. So we have this kind of distance or this kind of gap between people see them, they say that they've witnessed at least one, but that they haven't personally been impacted yet. And then the other piece that's here is very few people can point to the cause of those impacts, right? So we have a kind of scenario where for many years we've seen increasing concern on climate change and climate change impacts. And we've also seen kind of an increase of the basic understanding that it is burning fossil fuels and that it is caused by humans. In the last couple of years, what we've seen is a reversal of that. So we have a number of key indicators. This is a part of what Re.Climate does. We look across, like 90 different surveys, every year, and we look for trends. And so, look at that. And so one of the trends that we're seeing is that both concern about climate change is starting to go down, and we're also seeing that belief in man-made climate change is also starting to go down. This is problematic. One would think that those things would be solid, that this would be something that we wouldn't see a regression on, but yet here we are. The other thing that I'd like to point out is that the prairies are different. We all live here. I think that we know that. The prairies are a little bit different. But what you see is differences in terms of our perception of the risk. We see differences in terms of belief in man-made climate change. We see differences in various attitudes, supports for policies, et cetera, et cetera. So by and large, it doesn't matter which kind of thing you flip open, you will likely see Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba kind of on the end of the spectrum for attitudes and beliefs. In part, this is because we also see a huge divide in our political views, right? So where you fit and who you vote for has a very significant impact and influence on how you understand the problem, your perception of the risks, your sense of what the solutions are, et cetera. So in this one, I think it's quite startling. So if you vote for the Conservative Party of Canada, 34% would say that climate change is a crisis and we need to act quickly. If you vote for Liberals or NDP, that rises to about 83, 82%. Similarly, if you ask this similar question, break it out in the same way, if you ask whether wildfires are directly linked to climate change, you also see a division based on, how we vote. So you could kind of almost overlay attitudes about climate change, perceptions of climate change with a political map, right? So what we have in common here in Alberta and in Saskatchewan and in Manitoba is that we tend to have more conservative discourse. We have more conservative media. We have more conservative leaders who are talking about this within the media. Because by and large, it is still politicians who are having this conversation. And I'll get to that in a little bit. So the other thing that I think is important around kind of how people are engaging with this or understanding this is that hot events are kind of more salient, or they're easier for understand, or people make sense of them more quickly than wet events. So forest fires, heat waves. What we see here is that 63%, 74% would say that they're seeing more of those, like they're more salient. People make sense of that more than if you have heavy rainfall or floods. So it makes sense. It's helpful to actually work with public opinion, work with public perception, and talk about hot things. Not to say that don't talk about floods, but just be aware that when you're having a public conversation, people are going to make sense of the hot part more than they're going to make sense of the wet part. The other thing I think is really interesting, this came out of a slide or, a piece of research from, I think it was Leger, is that women across the board on every single one of these things are perceiving or will say that they see more extreme weather, more of these things than men do. So women, for whatever reason, are also thinking or seeing that extreme weather events have increased more so than their male counterparts. All right. So that's just like a little bit of background, right? So we're going to talk about extreme weather. Politics matters. Prairies are different, partly because we're political. We have a different political conversation here. We see tanking or concern is going in the wrong direction. And we see belief in man-made climate change going in the wrong direction. So what are we going to do about it? What does it mean to move people? And I think anybody who, I don't know, how many of you actually do public events where you're out talking to people in, yeah, okay, good, right? So this will be very familiar ground. So when we're having conversations with people, often what we'll find are there's 4 kind of things that we encounter, right? One is going to be resistance, right? So people all of a sudden, and you might see this in the media or in kind of, it appears in different ways. So you might see threats to people feeling oh, yeah, I can't go into my community. You've evacuated my community. This is a threat, and I'm going to push back because I don't have control. Might also have boomerang effects, right? So people who are on the kind of mitigation side might be out there talking about how much more affordable heat pumps are going to make your life, and you're going to save money. And what it does is, if often it's not unusual for that to have a boomerang effect. You want it to persuade somebody, you want it to convince them, and in fact, what you've done is you've just pissed them off. Rationalization, so counter arguing, motivated reasoning. So it doesn't really matter what you say, people will make sense of and have a way to explain why they think something, why they act a certain way, why you can't do it this way. This is like a trap that we often, fall into. Solution skepticism, this is across the board. It doesn't matter if you're talking about EVs, if you're talking about wildfire, solutions. There are kind of very consistent things that come up in conversation where people aren't quite sure about something. They're just kind of suspicious. And a lot, some of this is legitimate, some of it's not legitimate, but it's something that we're going to encounter. And then the final one is fatalism. And this is really the big one, I would say, for the people in this room is, how do we not get so depressing for people that they just kind of check out, right? It's I don't want to talk about this anymore. It's it's too much. There's nothing we can do about it. It's too late. So these are the kind of pitfalls that communications inadvertently activates rather than, getting across. So when we want to move people, we want to try our best not to fall into these pitfalls, not to fall into these traps. And so some of the things, and I don't have a lot to say because we're going to have a good conversation instead, are just ways that you can kind of think about some principles around how to move past them, how to move people, how to motivate people without falling into this. All right, education. So I probably have said 1,000 times, we are not going to give people the information so that they rationalize their way into action, because we know that that doesn't work, right? People are not rational. You're not going to give them enough information that they're somehow going to change their behavior. There's so many other more complicated things that are happening. But in this case, education is super helpful. Why? Because people are already making sense of climate change as floods and fires, et cetera. What we tend not to do, however, is add in the rest of it, right? So what we want to do is to make a connection to the cause and to the solutions. Because if people have a weak understanding of what the cause and the problem is, they're also not going to understand the solutions that we're talking to them about. So when we talk about wildfires or floods or heat waves or droughts, et cetera, just make sure that you're closing the loop, right? Wildfires are driven by climate change, which is caused by burning fossil fuels. When we get to the point where we're talking about not burning as many fossil fuels, it starts to make better sense. So we have a moment in time during an extreme weather event or during a wildfire, during an impact, where we can start to lay down some of the just basic understanding and literacy that will help us have conversations that are more complex later, right? So when I go back to this point that, we have tanking levels of understanding that climate change is man-made, we are in a moment right now where we can be reinforcing and underpinning the understanding that these events are being driven by climate change, which is caused by burning fossil fuels, right? We are in a public education moment just on basic literacy, and we need to take that moment while we have it. The other piece is making it human. So I don't know if you follow Re.Climate, if you follow a number of other organizations, all focused on, this kind of task of how do we use communications. Again and again and again, if you're doing message testing online, if you're doing focus groups, like, it doesn't really matter. One of the key principles is making it about human beings, right? So we are motivated by protecting the people in the places that we love. And that translates into like super simple things. If you have an ad and you put a human being, like a face that's visible in it versus not, the engagement rate is like blows the other one out of water, like 20 points or more, right? So making it human is really important. So having stories about human beings, it makes it relevant, it makes it about their local community, et cetera. The other piece is let's start talking like humans, right? When we use language that is highly technical, and I appreciate that scientists are, bound by codes of ethics and standards and, whatnot. But what it tends to do is it tends to exclude people. People feel like, oh, I don't understand that language, so this really isn't a conversation for me. So the language that we use is like really, really important. And there's a lot of really great thinking and good research around what words not to use and what words to use. And the more simple you can make it, the more clear and vivid that you can make it, the better you will accomplish this kind of understanding. People might not agree with you, and that's fine, but at least they feel like they should be in the conversation. And stories. So stories, I think we've been talking a lot about them. They're very powerful ways to deliver the kind of data that you actually want to deliver, right? People don't really, if you say there's 50 zombie wildfires burning in Alberta, right? That's like, that's kind of serious. But if you then pair that with an actual story of somebody who's on the front lines, who's living in this place, the kind of experiences that they're having, that is much more vivid, and people will remember that, right? So what stories do is they help us see ourselves because we are like that person, they help us see and feel something about it. They're emotive. It gives us the why we should be acting, right? Because we're motivated because we love people and we love places. And then the analysis of the data shows us how we should be acting, right? So it gives us the pathway. So we don't drop off it entirely. But the most powerful way to do this is when you couple the two together. So when you have stories that contain kind of the stats and the pathways and the science, et cetera, but they're wrapped within a story that allows us to feel something about it, or to feel something about the people who are impacted, or that this story is about, or the community, or the community strength, et cetera. So use stories. The other thing is thinking of in phases. So this is kind of really coming out of some work that I've been looking at around wildfires in particular. And what it does is it helps to show us that we're not talking about this one thing all the time. We don't have one person talking all the time, and we're not doing the same thing all the time. There is a moment that is before an event, there's a moment that's during an event, and then there's a moment that's after an event. And when we go back to those kind of pitfalls and traps and things like that, no one wants to hear an advocacy group, like talking about something while there's a woman with 3 children and their house is burning down, right? There are moments in time when we have conversations, and then and with, and profiling particular people. So before an event, this is where climate scientists are really helpful. This is where experts are helpful, et cetera. This is about foreshadowing and about setting the scene, right? It's like we're about to move into a period of drought. We're about to move into a period of, increased wildfires, and that we're laying down that kind of the understanding, the narrative to say, and it's driven, these things are coming. They're driven by climate change. They will be, more extreme, more frequent, all of the things that, we will be saying. It's also the points, it's that education piece. It might be the part where some groups are advocating, right? So it's like, forest fires are coming. This is why we need, better mental health. That's one of the conversations that we had today, or why, it's important that we begin to reduce our emissions. Every little bit helps, et cetera. And that we're also building capacity for the other stages. So in that kind of pre-period, you have way more room to be talking about science, to be talking about policy, to be talking about programming, to be doing the education, et cetera. Once you actually move into the events itself, that's when the kind of advocates and the policy people kind of step back. That's when the people who are on the front lines, who are experiencing it, who have the stories about what this is doing to them and their communities and their families, that's when we hand the mic to those people. So who people want to hear from in this stage, they want to hear from potentially, elected officials and mayors. They want to hear from parents, soccer coaches. They want to hear from doctors and nurses, wildfire firefighters. They want to hear from conservationists, right? What is this doing to animals? What's this doing to the, the places that I love? So when we get into that during part, pull back on the advocacy stuff, pull back on the policy stuff. It's not the time. That's when we hand the mic to the people who can tell people and share those stories about like why we then need to act later on, right? That's the moment where we're educating and kind of drawing that why we're doing this. And then finally, after, and I think somebody talked about this today, is that's when we do the sense making. How are wildfires and mudslides connected together? How is drought and water restrictions connected together? How are increased health budgets and wildfire smoke connected together? That's when we go back and we retell the story and make sense of it for people, right? And then we start talking again about solutions and advocating for things that will help provide answers. So this is a roadmap to help you think about like who should be talking, what they should be talking about, and what are the kinds of things that you need to be planning for before, during, and after. I'm assuming that most of the people in this room fit in the before part and the after part. We're all human beings, right? But for the most part, you're going to be taking the mic before and after. And then those kind of human stories, rapid response, that kind of piece will happen during. This one's tricky, but bear with me. When we talk about targets that are in 2050 or 2030 or wherever that might be, it's like way too far away, particularly in the context of what people are actually dealing with right now. You know, what we see are like tanking concern about climate change, in part because people are concerned about housing and affordability and cost of living. And, you know, there are other issues that we're dealing with. What doesn't help is when we push solutions or we push the problem really far away, right? It reinforces this kind of tendency that we want, like, it's not going to be me, it's not going to be, you know, in my lifetime, et cetera. And what we have an opportunity to do instead is to talk about, you know, what's happening right now in our community. So in the last, like, bite size it, 4, 5 years. In the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen this kind of change in the community. We've seen this many increases in wildfires or days of, you know, extreme heat or et cetera. So focus on the now, focus on what solutions and how they would help right now rather than pushing it far out into the future. It will be more helpful and it will get you farther in terms of that kind of basic understanding than if we're to really talk far in the future, and where, you know, what this place is going to look like in 30 years. I've talked a little bit about this, supporting a range of voices. I think, you know, the other piece of this is that the messenger is the message for many people, right? So for some people, they are, you know, want to hear from, well, I don't know, does anybody want to hear from a politician? But for some people, they might be like a really credible and trustworthy. Research would say that's not the case. But, you know, for the most part, people want just people who are like on the ground, who are nonpartisan, who are just, you know, have a knowledge about what they're doing. It's engineers, like we tested it, right? So we put a whole list of things in front of people. They want to hear about an engineer from the city of Calgary, right? Talk about something. They want to hear from a forest ecologist. They want to hear from a nurse. They want to hear from people who are like real life. This is their job. They're not going to try to persuade or they're not trying to sell me anything. That's who people actually trust. Unfortunately, when you go back and we do media analysis and things like that, the people who get the mic for the most part are politicians, and they are by far the least trusted by the general public. So it's not always possible, you know, within your organizations to, um, you know, like uh, elbow, you know, the mayor out of the way or whatnot. But in your conversations, you can be doing community groups or community events. You can be doing social stories and posts and things like. There's a lot of other channels where you could be providing more room for other kinds of voices around this topic. Finally, I've got like 2 more points here. There's like no magic way and there's no magic word that is going to convince somebody who's like reactive or skeptical or, you know, those kind of pitfalls, you know, that we had at the top. It's kind of a little more complicated than that. But I would say that there are ways that we can talk about impacts. We can talk about extreme weather. We can talk about what's the role of public and government, that are not that are more centrist or right of center, like how we frame it. So I get this question a lot. Well, can we just like drop climate off entirely? I would say no, right? We still need to keep climate in the picture. You might think that everybody hates climate change, it's super polarizing, et cetera, but it's not true. We just hear more from those people, right? It's like 12% or less, even in Alberta. I think we did 15% or less of people are kind of opponents, for lack of a better word. For the most part, people are either not thinking about this at all because they're busy with other things, or they're quite supportive. They're quite concerned. They're like, very happy to have this conversation. So when we're talking or we're messaging or we're, trying to create key messages or whatever, just think about how you can talk about this in a way that is just relevant for the person that you're talking about. Could be about protecting communities from fires. Could be about preparing. I loved that. Resilience is preparing or planning. Like, yeah. Talking about investing, right? So this idea that when we're building back, we're not going to be building back a rec center in the next 50 years. So we might as well do it right now, right? We might as well be investing in the kind of infrastructure that we need for the kind of world and weather that we live in. Obviously, safety is important. Health is like the main hook for most people, right? You're talking about, mental health is kind of a little bit specialized, I would say, but air quality, pollution, those are all like that's a very fine way to talk about impacts and extreme weather and why we need to act on it. Security. And then this piece around later's too late. For any of you who are geeking out about this, like I am, there was like this huge study around like, this is like the best, frame for, talking about this stuff. And I think that it works well for people who are, it's tricky. Basically, it either means for some people, like later's too late means could be like, we're not going to build this building again. So we might as well do it properly now. But for some people, it's like fatalism, right? It's like later's too late. Why bother? So I'm going to leave this slide here and it's included in the deck, but it's basically, we went through, I don't know, 150 different, pieces of information. And here are a few more takeaways that you should just don't think about it, just put it in your, practice and take it on board. So that's where I'll leave it. I'm getting the cue that I've talked too long. So. Thank you, Amber. Hey, I'll come.
We will take 10 minutes of questions though, because we know Amber's topic's interesting and you're such a compelling speaker. That's why it went so quickly. So if we could go to the Mentimeter into the room. So Heather, you're up first. You beat everyone to the mic. Why do we spend so much time on social media and other forums listening to information who are not experts, who have an agenda and are often criticized? Because I would say that I'm describing so much what happening with service current
These are a whole bunch of people who are not listening to nonpartisan experts by choice.
Looking for my green light. Oh, okay. Which? Sorry, Michael.
Oh, it should be working now.
Hello.
Check one. Sorry, we have 8 microphones throughout the room. And a good rule of thumb, ladies and gentlemen, speak thumbs distance away from the microphone so we can hear you nice and loud and clear. Thank you.
I love that. Well, I mean, there's just like so much to say about that. best thought first, or first thought, best thought is there are a lot of people who are just not engaged in this conversation at all. They're very uncertain. They have their own personal experiences. They're unsure what to think. And when they encounter misinformation, it becomes very, very persuasive. And I think that, you know, when we take a look at traditional media, for the most part, they're doing a good job. You know, they're not actually spreading misinformation until they start covering and reporting political leaders who are spreading misinformation, right? So misinformation is kind of creeping into traditional media through the reporting on, you know, political leaders who are spreading it. And then online, I mean, this is kind of a whole other thing, but a lot of infrastructure has been built to create direct channels to people over the long term with the explicit intent of, you know, having a long-term conversation about them to undermine, you know, credibility in science, to create and seed doubt, and to replace that with, you know, solutions that are false, et cetera. That's not to say there isn't like people shouldn't legitimately be want to wrestle through a conversation and talk through something. But yes, there are definitely organized campaigns around, you know, misinformation. The other, so that's one piece. So like, yes, misinformation is happening and it's like a real serious problem. I think the other thing that I would say is most people in that kind of like disengaged segment of the population look to friends and family for information. That's more who they trust. That's who they want to hear from. You know, so there's like a lot of skepticism around, can we trust media? Can we trust, you know, politicians? And people look to their friends and family for information about many topics. So I think that by extension, this kind of preference for authentic, you know, just like knowledgeable people is in part, you know, an extension of this, you know, I don't know what information I can trust. And I want to hear from people who have experience in the real world doing the real thing. So that goes everywhere from like the HVAC guy. I just want to talk to the HVAC guy. I want to talk to the guy at Home Depot about, you know, heat pumps, to I want to hear from the wildfire ecologist. Don't know if that answers your question, but those are a few things that are happening, kind of, or conversations that are happening right now.
Thank you. Go ahead.
So you mentioned that just telling people, giving people the facts won't necessarily change their behavior. So in Manitoba, we recently, I work for Manitoba Emergency Management Organization, and our subscription to overland flood insurance is very low in Manitoba compared to the national average. So we're trying to like raise awareness and tell people, you know, floods are happening more frequently. You need to, you know, shop around if you don't get insurance through your regular provider, that type of message. So you kind of crushed my spirit when you said that.
Don't be crushed. Don't be crushed.
When you said that's not going to change their behavior. But I'm just wondering, are there any like kind of tidbits that you can share that like have been shown to change behavior?
Yeah, I mean, I think that don't be crushed, right? There is so much that could be done just to make it easier for people to like find information, period, right? There could be a whole group of people that just don't know where to go, don't know that they should be thinking about this, and would be really motivated to go and to do that. There's probably a whole other group of people where this is not relevant for them at all, right? It's not, or there are barriers, right? They can't afford it, or, you know, like it's just, so what I'm trying to say is that for just when we understand who we're talking to and what we need them to do and can like super dial that in, then information can be motivating, right? But we need to get to the point where we're lining up the right message with the right audience, and managing our expectations. I think probably, the kind of rule of thumb of like information, people are not going to reason their way to behavior change is kind of like the last 30 years. It's like climate change, climate change, climate change. Here's more science, here's more science, here's more science. And here we are, right? Because it's just more complicated than that.
This one's going to be a quick one and the last one, and I know that's sad news for you, but Amber's going to be sticking around and she's going to help us answer these after the event. Evelyn, last question.
Thank you. Just a very quick question. So do you have any advice on how to deal with climate change is a problem coming from elsewhere? The whole issue around it's not a problem here, it's from China. Do you have any advice about how to deal with that particular issue?
Yeah, it's super, super sticky. Because in part it's kind of true. Right? We're kind of all in it together. However, we just came out of field with a good piece of research. And what I would say that does work is if we can get a bit more realistic about Canada's performance. For the most part, people think that we're climate heroes, that like we're doing like a great job. When they start to hear more of the reality around how much pollution we've historically, emitted, how much pollution we emit right now, that we're one of the top 10, polluters in the world, and that if we don't do our part, we can't expect anybody else to do their part too. So it has to do with fairness. It has to do with, our share of the problem. Those tend to be the most effective responses to that. And it goes back to, that people don't know that we're actually as much of a polluting as we are. So I think there's that piece. I think the other piece is those countries, China in particular, is kind of like hitting it out of the ballpark when it comes to EVs and renewable energy. Like those stories are not getting out either. And so there's like a whole page of stock narratives that we know you will 100% encounter when you're having a conversation with people. My advice to you is be prepared, right? So we do have some kind of research that's coming out. We'll be publishing it next month that explores a little bit of that, but it's not you. It's like every single person who does this work in the country is looking at that. And there's kind of two sides to it. One, it's true. We're all in it together globally. There is no solution to wildfires, locally. But on the other hand, there are some things that help to strengthen the motivation for Canada to be an actor and do its part.
Thank you very much, Amber. We know we could have a whole conference on this, and we're going to one of these days soon. Let's thank Amber for her contribution. Amber?